Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice. We know this week there is a lot going on. The war in the Middle East, the gas prices soaring, the affordability crisis, the economic crisis that's brewing. There's a lot to take in and a lot to handle. And as part of all of that, but getting a little bit less attention than you might otherwise expect, are two things I want to make sure you know about. We are working on at the Brennan Center that we want to make sure you know about. One of them is that in the middle of all of this, despite everything that is going on, President Donald Trump has said that the number one priority for Congress is passing not an authorization for his war, not an economic policy, but something called the SAVE Act. You've heard about it from us before. It's a restrictive voting bill. We estimate that it would mean that at least 21 million people would lack the documents, a passport or a birth certificate, effectively, to be able to register and vote. And he has said now that he will not sign any other legislation until he signs the SAVE Act. He's pressing really hard for this. That's something that we want to discuss. We want to understand the brewing fight in Congress. We want to understand why this is such a bad idea, what's at stake, and what we think is going to happen. And to have that conversation, I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Eliza Sweren-Becker. She's the deputy director of our Voting Rights and Elections program, an expert on so many things having to do with our democracy, the author of a brilliant article on the Elections Clause. I say that only partly because she allowed me to co-author it with her, and much more. And then we're going to talk about, in the second half of this conversation, something you might have read about, which is the brewing fight over the role of artificial intelligence, AI, in the war effort and in defense policy generally, that has come to light with the fight between the company Anthropic and the Department of Defense. The Brennan Center has a report that we've looked at for many, many months on this whole issue of AI in defense, and the author of that report, Amos Toh, will be joining me for the second half of this conversation. But I'm going to start with the SAVE Act and hope that I'm going to be able to do it without steam coming out of my ears. Eliza, why, in the middle of all of this, is President Trump pushing the SAVE Act, which has already passed the House of Representatives and been blocked in the Senate?
Well, the president has been focused for over a year on a campaign to undermine the midterm elections. This happened starting day one of his administration when he pardoned roughly 1,500 people who stormed the Capitol violently, and it's been happening in the months since then. This is just one element of a federal campaign to interfere with our elections, to undermine confidence in our elections, and to stop people from participating in our elections.
And this bill, if it were to become law, would do that emphatically. As I said, our research shows that what it does, which is basically what it says, is you have to have a passport or a birth certificate and present them physically to register each time you register. 21 million people don't have ready access to those documents. It actually would affect a lot more people than that, because married women who change their names, their name is different perhaps on their birth certificate than their voter registration rolls. This bill passed the House and then was blocked in the Senate last year. It passed the House again this year, and so far it is once again blocked. The president devoted as much time in the State of the Union address to this as he did to previewing the war in Iran, which is quite mind-blowing. But he's also demanding that the bill do even more. What does he want to change in the legislation?
Well, as you said, the president is obsessed with the SAVE Act. He's obsessed with conspiracy theories about elections that he's been seeding for many years. The bill would, as you said, require a passport or birth certificate to register to vote. It would require voters to present those in person. It would be a five-alarm fire for American voters.
It would be the most restrictive voting bill federal voting bill ever passed by Congress. When the federal government gets involved, usually it's to try to promote voting rights, not always as much as it should. This would be the worst voting bill anybody can think of.
Absolutely. I mean, Congress historically has worked to protect the freedom to vote. It has done that to stop states from discriminating against Black voters and other voters of color. It has done that to improve our systems of elections. If Congress were to pass the SAVE Act, to my mind, the first federal voter suppression bill that I can think of, it would be turning its back on the history of Congress to protect the freedom to vote and really be a new era of election law in this country.
So we're definitely against it.
Indeed.
We know that. And he, in the State of the Union address, he chose the worst possible argument to make, I think, to try to get any kind of, buy-in from people who are not already in his base. He said we need to do this because cheating is rampant, in effect, by Democrats. And it really mobilized the Democrats to stand up against it.
Yeah, I mean, the president has a history of saying the quiet part out loud. He has said essentially that he wants to pass the SAVE Act so he can ensure that Republicans win elections.
So he literally said that at the Doral Golf Club this week, Monday of this week, when the Republicans had their gathering, their strategy gathering. He said to reporters, we have to pass this so the Republicans can win. There's a kind of a traditional definition of a gaffe in politics, which is when a politician accidentally speaks the truth, and that would be an example of him saying, as you said, saying the quiet part out loud. Now, he wants to make the bill worse. He wants to, first of all, they added other provisions to this proof of citizenship, the passport, show your papers requirement. They added voter ID requirements. Now, voter ID is all over the country already. That is not the worst part of the bill. But they want to end, he's demanding that they add more to end vote by mail, basically, which is widely popular with voters from all over the country right now.
Yes. I mean, the SAVE Act now is essentially the SAVE Act on steroids. It has additional voter suppression policies than it had last year, for example. It would also require states to turn over their sensitive voter rolls to this Department of Homeland Security.
So
and
Kristi
states have
Noem is out, but Mark Wayne Mullen,
famous election denier,
an election denier, mixed martial arts guy, but an election denier, he would now be the one getting all this data. And what they're doing is they're saying to states, we were wondering why they were trying to hoover up all this data. It's quite clear. They want to actually force states to purge eligible voters from the rolls in the run-up to the election.
It's clear that they're trying to meddle with voterless maintenance, which is a process that states undertake. And states undertake that because Congress mandated that states undertake that. This is a role that states play to keep our voter rolls clean. They have been doing it successfully.
We want the voter rolls to be clean.
Absolutely.
We want people to be purged from the rolls, but not eligible voters. And
Correct.
And we're not worried that Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck are going to get pushed off the rolls, but that actual live human beings who have the right to vote would show up and find out that they've lost their right to vote when they don't have really a meaningful ability to do something about it. So they're pushing the bill. They're trying to make it worse. He has been urging the Senate to do its work in a different way than it has been doing it to get this done. Now, as you know, the filibuster has become very entrenched in how the Senate operates, which means effectively you need 60 votes to pass regular legislation like this. Now, they don't actually stand there and talk like Mr. Smith goes to Washington. It's kind of an agreement that if you're going to not be able to get 60 votes, that they're not going to make people hold the floor. And we've actually at the Brennan Center been very critical of the filibuster, and I think it actually, in the long run, has been a bad thing for the country. But that is the rule right now. And what President Trump is demanding that the Senate do is go to what's called a talking filibuster. It might arguably not require a rules change in the Senate, but basically to make the Democrats hold the floor like in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and actually do the filibuster to prevent the bill from getting voted on in a majority vote. But as Senator John Thune, the Republican leader, has said, be careful what you ask for, because what would potentially be the consequence of that?
I mean, this would invite an old-fashioned floor fight. It means Democrats could hold the floor indefinitely. They could introduce amendments on any subject, and they could prevent the president from pushing his agenda forward in Congress altogether.
They could propose healthcare bills.
Sure.
They could propose affordability bills. They could read the Epstein files on the floor of the Senate.
They could read the dictionary on the floor of the Senate. They could read whatever they wanted to hold the floor.
And that is the kind of thing that used to happen back in the day when there were these talking filibusters. But it really cedes control of the floor to the Democrats. And it also takes a huge amount of time and means nothing else gets done. No judges get confirmed. We're still in the middle of a partial government shutdown with the Department of Homeland Security not being funded. And this is why John Thune, the Republican leader, has said, I don't think this is going to happen. He's been quite thrown as much cold water on this as he can. Senator Schumer has been very adamant. He called this bill dead on arrival. He said, if they bring this to a vote, we're going to do everything we have to. But we do actually think this is likely to come to a vote, to a cloture vote at the very least, at some point in the next week or two. Is that right?
Yes, that's what Senator Thune has said. There are two things that are going on here. One is that, as you said, the coin of the realm in the Senate is time. And if the Republicans give up their control over the floor, that means the Democrats get to decide how to use their time. That's a big risk for Republicans. The other thing that's going on is actually the SAVE Act is very unpopular. Last year, as you said, the SAVE Act passed the House, and then it went over to the Senate and sat, and nothing happened.
Hundreds of thousands of people are contacting
Exactly.
Congress.
That's because there's huge public opposition. People understand what the SAVE Act would require, which is a passport or a birth certificate to register to vote, and that millions would be blocked from voting.
And there was a video last year about women in particular, the women whose names are changed, that just went viral without much forethought on the part of people who were pounding the table on this. And people don't like their rights being taken away. And they also want to know why, in heaven's name, is this the priority with everything that's going on when they haven't had a vote yet on whether to authorize this extraordinary military operation that's taking place, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So one thing everybody should know is there's going to be a big voting rights fight in the Congress right now. And we think it's really important that people speak up, that those citizens who don't like this, who don't think this is the right thing to do, let Congress, let the Senate know this, because it definitely has an impact.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say call your senator no matter who they are. Call your senator if you think they already support the SAVE Act. Call your senator if you know they already oppose the SAVE Act. Let your Senate offices know where you stand on the SAVE Act and that you oppose it, because hearing from constituents really matters. And hearing from a volume of constituents like we know they already have this year, like we know they did last year, that matters.
I will mention one thing, and then I want to talk about other ways that there's been an attempt to undermine the election. A lesson that I hope those of us who care about voting rights, who want to improve and expand our elections, can take from this, which is, this is the anniversary of the March on Selma, and in fact of when President Lyndon Johnson went before Congress to propose the Voting Rights Act. I write about this in the briefing newsletter. And that was when he said, we shall overcome. It was one of the great moments in American history. And Johnson really used all the powers of his office to expand voting rights. Here, Trump is using the powers of his office. He's using the bully pulpit to try to restrict voting rights. He's trying to undo that very progress. But pushing Congress to act, as kooky as it may seem in a setting like this, is what presidents do. And when I think about something like the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which were the key voting bills that were before Congress during the Biden presidency, if that White House, if that president had put pressure on Congress early and made it a priority, as Trump is, we would be living in a different democracy today. And I do hope that if there is a moment when we have a chance once again to talk about, to craft, and to enact reforms, that we take the lesson that you really got to push hard for it. As outrageous to me and as absurd as it is to see this spectacle playing out, it's also a reminder of what can really happen if you put your shoulder to the wheel.
Well, as you mentioned, I've studied the elections clause, and essentially what we know from the Constitution is the president doesn't have any control over elections, but the president does have a bully pulpit. The president can tell Congress what his priorities are, and it's a shame we didn't see Biden before using that bully pulpit to call for passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. But before the Voting Rights Act was passed, MLK Jr. had an op-ed in the New York Times calling voting rights civil right number one. It's the right that protects all rights. And if we could have the enthusiasm that LBJ showed for voting rights, for protecting the freedom to vote coming out of the White House, I think we'd have a very different democracy today and much more participation.
And of course, as we know, it was the leadership, the activism of people like Dr. King, the courage of people like John Lewis and those marchers on the bridge at Selma, putting their bodies on the line, and the televised impact of seeing the brutality that forced LBJ to, he was for voting rights, but he actually was forced by circumstances and by public outcry to actually do what he did. So it's always an interplay between activism and people in power. But you mentioned the elections clause, so we'll talk about that for 5 or 6 hours because we can. But don't worry, we're not really going to. That's the provision of the Constitution that says states run elections. Congress has an important, legitimate role to set national laws, we hope good laws. Presidents have no role. And so when we talk about the campaign that's been underway for a year to undermine the elections, so much of it has actually been illegal or counter to the Constitution. You've been very involved actually in the litigation and in studying what's going on. So it's also 1 year since there was an executive order. Now, there were like 47 executive orders that day. We talk about this executive order as though everybody knows about it, but actually there were a lot. So remind us what that executive order purported to do.
Absolutely. So last March, the president issued an anti-voting executive order. The cornerstone of that executive order is actually the same cornerstone of the SAVE Act, which is a mandate that a little-known election agency called the Election Assistance Commission require people to submit a passport or a citizenship document to register to vote using the federal form. As I said, the president is obsessed with this policy, and he's trying to get it done wherever he can. Other elements of the executive order attempt to enforce that mandate to require.
Well, it basically would have decertified all the voting machines.
Yes, it also ordered this same bipartisan independent agency over which the president does not control to change the standards that are used to certify voting machines and that several states have built into their state law and opted into to apply. It also mandated that DHS obtain and review all of the state voter rolls so we can see that DOJ is executing on that element of the executive order.
So let's stop there because we've talked about this a lot. This is the federal government going to the states saying, give us these voter rolls, and not just the public stuff.
Right.
Social Security numbers, private data, which they will then use or abuse or misuse in some way. And that also supposedly was in this executive order. Now, we always say these executive orders, a lot of them are basically malevolent press releases. They don't have much power, and he did not have the power to order this little independent agency to do this. But this is one example where the Brennan Center did something we don't always do, which is we went to court. And we actually sued, and you were one of the lawyers on this case. So,
yes.
So take us into the courtroom, with as much flair and drama as you can. What happened in that litigation?
Well, as you said, the law is very clear. The Constitution doesn't give any power over federal elections to the president. And so we figured, in addition to our ordinary advocacy, this was a really good opportunity to litigate because essentially it's a slam dunk. And
we represent the League of Women Voters.
We represent the League of Women Voters and several other organizations that register voters. And we're co-counsel with several other partner organizations. And we went to court and said just that. The president doesn't get to mandate rules for federal elections. The Elections Clause is very clear. That authority lies with states, and then superseding authority lies with Congress, and no authority lies with the president. And you don't have to be a lawyer to understand why. The framers wrote the Constitution because they didn't want a king. To give the president control over federal elections would essentially give the president control over electing himself. And we don't want that. We don't want that now, and we certainly didn't want that when the Constitution was written.
And we got a final order on Halloween, as I remember, and it's being appealed. But right now, we and others got this thing stopped. But this is not the only step. He's threatening other executive orders, and he is using the Department of Justice in all kinds of inappropriate ways, including trying to get states to turn over these voter records to the Department of Justice. I think almost every state has gotten a demand of that kind. 11 states have gone along. And again, we know that they're using it to try to specifically purge voters. They're using the Department of Justice to terrorize election officials and to try to cast doubt on the veracity of American elections. We all saw the FBI raid in Fulton County, Georgia, the one where not Christy, no, I have to keep all these people straight. Where
Tulsi
Gabbard was kind of lurking around, and they couldn't figure out
why she was there,
and the Justice Department said, we think she was just in the neighborhood. We have no idea. She said, I was personally ordered to do it by President Trump. And he said, I have no idea what this is, and I'm against it. And so she was part of this. And her aspect of this scam seems to be to try to claim foreign interference in the elections. But now we've learned that there's an FBI subpoena from Kash Patel's FBI in Arizona, in Maricopa County, to try to get from the legislature there records from the 2020 elections. There's this bizarre, backward-looking conspiracy mongering that goes on. And some of it is Trump's obsession. He knew he lost, but he's probably at some point convinced himself he didn't. But it's also to set the stage for sowing doubt, I think, in the next election. It's not just about 2020, but it's about 2026. This is something that's going to be fought over nonstop between now and November. What do you think people watching us today, other than having a stiff drink or getting their blood pressure medication or whatever, what should they be doing?
Well, the first thing to do is to understand that states and localities actually run elections. And in the vast, vast majority of cases, these are election officials that are working very hard to make sure we have free and fair elections. They are putting out correct information, and they are trying to make sure that their constituents can go out and vote. So you should trust your state and local election officials and the information that they are sharing with you.
And these elections have been free and fair despite all the pressure, despite COVID, despite all the lies, the threats of violence, the actual violence. The elections, if people think about their own experience, were largely uneventful. They weren't certainly accurate. And the election officials are these unsung heroes. I think people learn about them more and more. But we need to back them up. We need to make sure that law enforcement works with them. We need to make sure that governors and mayors and county officials and state attorneys general stand up to protect the system. And we also need to make sure everybody knows that this is a difficult time and that some of the things that we're worried about haven't even happened yet. Steve Bannon said that he thought ICE should surround the polls. That's something people really worry about.
I mean, that's flatly against the law. It's prohibited, and it would be criminal for federal troops to be at the polls or to interfere with elections. One thing I just want to go back to with respect to election officials being really American heroes is that's perhaps the most perverse part of the SAVE Act is that it attacks those very election officials.
How does it do that?
It imposes a huge administrative burden on them with absolutely no federal funding, and it imposes new criminal and civil liability on those election officials, including if they just make a mistake, even if the person that they get registered is in fact an eligible American citizen. So the very people who make our elections work, who essentially allow us to have a functioning democracy, are subject to more attacks and less resources under the SAVE Act. So not only would this be a terrible bill for voters, it would also be a terrible bill for election administration, for election officials. So that is another thing that people can do. You ask, what can people do? Again, call your senators, tell them no on the SAVE Act.
And out there in the real world, this is not a partisan issue nearly as much as it is on Capitol Hill, in the sense that quietly, a lot of state officials from the Republican Party, from both parties, say, this is how we run our elections. We use vote by mail. The elections are free and fair. I like to always point out that the Secretary of State of Louisiana, in what I assume was an earnest attempt to advance the MAGA cause, did a study of the voter rolls in Louisiana. And that is a place, with a kind of a fabled history of chicanery in elections. The famous quote from the former governor there, Earl Long, who said, "When I die, bury me in Louisiana. I want to stay active in politics." She looked at it and said, We've looked at 40 years, and I think it was we've identified maybe 79 people who we think might have been non-citizens during those 40 years when tens of millions of votes were cast. Exactly. It turned out, she said rather quietly, it's not actually a problem here. Same thing in Utah. Every time state officials from either party do a look at their own situation, they say, well, actually, it's not a problem in our state.
Not only was it the same thing in Utah, they found 0 non-citizens who voted in Utah, and the lieutenant governor of Utah, who is the chief election official in that state, was herself misidentified as a non-citizen because she was born abroad in a military family. So things may be wrong when relying on, for example, federal citizenship information that states are comparing their data to. And in any event, it's vast overestimates of any errors that are on the rolls, because we know that, for example, this data doesn't always account for people who have been naturalized and who are eligible American citizens who are registered to vote.
So we're going to keep working on this. People need to speak out. Let your senator and member of Congress know. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think I remember the phone number for Congress, which used to be 202-224-3121.
Very impressive.
If that's not true, we'll bleep it out and put some other number in. This is a week when our voices matter a lot. People should make a plan to vote. They should know that it's illegal for troops, for ICE to harass people, but we all know there's a lot of rumors and scared people out there, and we all need to band together to stand up for voters, to stand up for communities. And we at the Brennan Center are going to do our part to keep fighting in the courts, in the court of public opinion, and exposing what's going on. And we will be seeing what happens in Congress in the next week or two. History is being made one way or the other. Eliza Sweren-Becker, thank you so very much for what you do and for educating us and keeping us up to date. Now I'm going to have the chance to talk with my colleague Amos Toh. He is a senior counsel here at the Brennan Center in our Liberty and National Security program. He's the author of a new report out yesterday called The Business of Military AI, a very topical topic, a timely topic. One of the reasons that this is on the minds of many of us, even those who have not been looking at it, is, of course, that there's been, first of all, the war going on. We've learned that in Venezuela, that AI was very much used by the military in its operation there. It is part of what's going on and part of what's being used right now in the Middle East. And there was a very high profile and continues to be a high profile dispute, contract dispute, and now lawsuit between the Anthropic company, which is the company that makes or developed Claude, a very popular AI program, which is the fastest growing AI program, and the Defense Department over the terms of that contract, and in fact, how the military can and cannot, should and should not be able to use AI. And so, Amos, thank you for being part of this. You worked on this for a long time. You're really knowledgeable about it. One very basic question is, should this set of questions about AI and the military, should this be the topic of just a contract dispute, or is it something bigger and something deeper?
It is definitely something that requires democratic control and democratic decision making. It shouldn't just be left to the hands of private companies and, in contract disputes. That's why we've been calling on Congress to act, given what's going on in Iran and what happened in Venezuela and now what's happening with the contract dispute.
In other words, this is a very big issue for the country, for how we govern ourselves, for how the incredible power of AI can be used for good or for ill. And it's something that actually, we think, demands public debate and congressional action. So let's sort of take the lens back a little bit. I won't ask you to define AI because that's probably too broad. But what does it mean in the context of military use, and how widespread is military use of AI?
So I would say that the Pentagon has defined AI quite simply, that it is technology that can be used as a substitute for tasks that require human intelligence. And essentially, the way that the Pentagon has invested in AI is what we found to be in two ways, right? First, that it has been increasingly fielding this technology to conduct surveillance, intelligence analysis, and targeting. So what you're seeing, for example, in the strikes in Iran is the fruition of some of those efforts. And we are also increasingly seeing the use of AI in building out autonomous weapons. The Pentagon has been under quite immense pressure to keep up with rapid adoption of small drone warfare, as illustrated in the Ukraine war. And so it's increasingly trying to field fleets of drones that are able to conduct that kind of warfare.
And interestingly, President Zelenskyy of Ukraine gave a speech, I believe at the United Nations, where he said he thought it was extraordinarily important that there be public control and actually negotiations over the use of drones, the use of autonomous weaponry, because, first of all, he saw how powerful it was, how in an asymmetric way a smaller country could really make extraordinary progress in the use of those weapons, but how dangerous it could be too. He said he thought it was more dangerous than nuclear weapons, in part because you could have nuclear weapons deployed in that way. It was a real cry for a public understanding of not just the gee whiz, oh, look at this cool technology, but understanding that, as with any technology, there needs to be a public set of guardrails, a public set of values, and that is important to do even if the people pushing the technology don't love it. So I want to go a little deeper. You mentioned the surveillance, and you mentioned the use of this in targeting. For somebody who isn't versed in this, who says, well, human beings make mistakes too, why isn't it better to have targeting, say, in a war done by AI rather than a person?
So I think some tasks, right, that humans are doing and actually better able to do, technology can't do as well, right? Even the most advanced forms of technology. So in 2024, it was reported that the Maven algorithms, essentially the system that is being used in the strikes in Iran, lacked accuracy when it came to identifying tanks, right? And, it was 60% of the time it could accurately identify a tank in good weather, and then that degraded to 30% in snowy conditions. Whereas soldiers, right, were effectively identifying tanks accurately 84% of the time. And then there are ways in which AI is being used that are simply beyond its technical capacities, right? So if you apply AI and facial recognition, for example, to images that are too dimly lit or where people's faces are obscured or incredibly grainy, that's not something humans can actually make out, right, to discover the identity of that person, but it's also something that AI can't do simply because the image has degraded to such an extent where it's not possible. So I think when you layer that kind of inaccuracy on top of the fact that a lot of the time when you put humans in the loop and have humans kind of checking these mistakes and errors, they still tend to believe that the AI is more objective and more accurate because this is something that a presumably objective technology has, told you is accurate.
Well, because with AI, of course, so often we don't actually, it's hard to look under the hood because even the people who are the engineers or others who create it can't entirely tell you what's gone into it or why it's saying what it's saying. And if you think about the hallucinations that we're all used to. But it is the case, too, that the track record in recent weeks has shown some considerable success. And so it does seem like this is going to be a bigger and bigger part of how wars are fought, how militaries operate around the world, and both in terms of protecting the lives of American troops, which is extraordinarily important, but just the competition among countries. And what's so striking to me in the fight between Anthropic, whose software has been used as part of this through Claude and other things, and the Defense Department, is it really boiled down to two issues that are issues that you've written are things that are public in their nature. One of them is the autonomous weapons and the targeting and the use of autonomous weapons without any human involvement. That's one of the objections that Anthropic had. The other one has to do with what it says was the planned use or the potential use of their software for domestic surveillance. So let's start with the autonomous weapons. Is that in fact something that they're right about? Is that something that we expect to happen that's happening already?
Yeah, I think that's happening already, right? I think, fully autonomous weapons, right? Weapons that actually have no human involvement between the identification of a target and firing, is already playing out in conflict zones. So if you think about purely defensive capabilities, right? Like a classic example would be like the Iron Dome system. Like that kind of shoots at missiles, incoming missiles.
It has to be done.
Yeah, so that is an example that may be, fairly unobjectionable. I think what we are really worried about is the use of kind of offensive weapons and offensive capabilities that is mobilized to fire on the ground, possibly human targets without any involvement between identification and firing. And that's where we think the risk, right, of failure can be catastrophic and really lead to excessive civilian harm.
And so in terms of what should be done about that issue, about the autonomous weapons, either through Congress or some other means, what kinds of guardrails are we urging be put in place, and who should do that?
Right. So I think the first thing to know about AI is that it requires so much data to train, to run on, to operate, to analyze. And the way that Congress can really meaningfully restrict the development of a technology that protects privacy is to impose privacy protections, to actually rein in the data collection and analysis by not just the military, but also other intelligence agencies. So, for example, we've called on Congress to pass the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which would essentially restrict the government's purchases of commercially sensitive data that they would otherwise need a warrant to get.
And this goes to the other thing that Anthropic was saying that they were concerned about, which was the use of this technology for domestic surveillance. And the bill has the Fourth Amendment in the title, but I think a lot of people don't realize that the Fourth Amendment applies when a police officer is doing a search, but there is so much data for sale out there in the marketplace that every company buys and that permeates the whole economy, and that in a way you can get the same information without worrying about the Fourth Amendment if you just go buy a commercial program. A lot of people would hear this and say, well, if it's already out there, what's the problem? I mean, how realistic is it to stop government from getting this information if the bad guys can get it, or if I can get it when I'm using my credit card to buy the information?
Well, so I think the first thing to know is that actually potentially violates the spirit of Supreme Court precedent that indicates that the government must actually get a warrant or a court order in order to access, cell phone location records that is collected by commercial parties.
And this is how one of the ways the Supreme Court has tried to catch up with the 21st century as these justices scratch their heads and figure out what a cell phone is, how the internet works, and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Well, it can be a little painful to watch them do it. But whenever there's been a new technology, telephones, telegraphs, there has to be a period where you adapt the principles of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to those new technologies. That's not really actually a new thing. It's happened many other times in our history, even with something as breathtakingly new as AI.
Yeah, even with something as new as AI, I would say it's an evolution, not a revolution, right? It's increasing amounts of data that is being used to train the technology and making it more and more granular in its analysis of other forms of data.
And so the legislation you described, is this a partisan issue on Capitol Hill, or is this something that people from both parties are getting riled up about?
I think that there is kind of bipartisan momentum for this, but it's just not kind of gotten over the finish line, in part because of objections from national security and intelligence agencies.
And increasingly, the spending of tech companies in elections, which the New York Times wrote about in the last week, and a lot of other evidence that companies that had not actually been particularly involved in the campaign money game are now getting very involved because they see that they can get a big payoff, big return, payout, whatever, for not that much money in the large scheme of things. So there's legislation. Does Congress have the technological savvy to even understand what the issues are?
So I think that that's sadly lacking, right? I think a lot of Congress relies on sometimes like industry-funded experts, but even beyond that, there's very limited resources that Congress has to understand how rapidly this technology is evolving. And it has not, as a result, like grappled with the ways that AI is actually amplifying surveillance. We're not just talking about collecting data, right? It's running AI on top of the data being collected to generate.
Because there's so much data everywhere, but it's not that useful unless you have the AI to kind of put it in the food processor and turn it into something that can be used in that way.
Yes.
And right. So that's the legislative agenda. And as we all know that AI is going to be a bigger and bigger issue. People are worried about job loss. They're worried about energy prices and all these other things. Mm-hmm. This is part of the agenda for how we as a society bring human values into this new technology. The other question, though, is this fight between Anthropic and the Defense Department. Because if the Defense Department, which has designated this company, which makes the software that they just used to launch the war in Iran, as a supply chain risk and as a national security threat, it's an extraordinary ratcheting upward of the authoritarian use of government to bully a private company. At least that's what Anthropic argues. Other people say, well, it really shouldn't be up to a company to say whether how the Defense Department, how the taxpayers, how the government should do its work. Why should a company have the ability to make those decisions?
Well, the company is essentially party to a contract with the government. And within the context of that contract, it can impose restrictions that it says are its policy, and the government can choose to accept or reject them.
In other words, they don't have to contract with them.
Yes. So, the department certainly does not have to contract with them, but to go over and above that and to designate them as a supply chain risk and shut them out of defense contracting completely is a way to kind of send a signal to other companies that actually chills, right, their exercise of First Amendment rights, because it essentially is a way to pressure these companies and say, we are not going to buy technology unless you let us use it however we see fit. So I think like that is kind of the central problem and the central abuse that we are seeing. And
there is a lawsuit that has just been filed, and no doubt this will play out in coming days in the courts, but not just in the courts. Amos, thank you for giving this so much thought, for bringing your expertise to bear on this. The report has been in the works for a long time, but the urgent currency of it and the news every day is making it clearer than ever that this is a really important topic. So thank you so much for educating us and for being on top of this. And I want to add just a thought or two about where this all fits into the Brennan Center's work, but really the broader task for our country. As I said, this in a way is not the first time that we've faced issues like this. Whenever there is new technology, it upends the law. It can upend settled relations. It can change things very rapidly. And it can take society, government, the political process, time to catch up. It happened with railroads. So much of the law that we have in our country comes out of the changes in the law that were made in the 1870s and 80s and 90s to deal with this new phenomenon of national corporations, but especially of railroads that linked us together. We saw the need to apply the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, all the elements of the Bill of Rights to new communications technologies as they developed all across the 20th century. Is television covered by the First Amendment? Is radio covered by the First Amendment? What about a broadcast licensed station when there were only a few licenses given out? Did that have a different set of rules? Back then, the answer was yes. The internet, and so on. And so even though AI looks astonishing, looks dazzling, looks like it may be a societal change that will transform the economy, is it as big a deal as the Gutenberg press, or is it just yet another disruptive technology? Those are things we don't know yet. But what we do know is that government and the law need to catch up. And it's not just a matter of saying, oh, wow, this is really cool. Oh, we don't want to slow this down. Oh, we don't want to block the development of this really, really important technology. At every step of the way, it's important to apply basic constitutional principles, basic human values, and to understand that we need to control the technology if we don't want the technology to control us. That's certainly true in the context of the use in the military, where there's so much risk to property, to lives, to societies of something that can get out of control. And we're seeing it happen with extraordinary speed. We saw it in the battlefields of Ukraine, how fast that changed. We're seeing it now. And if we think that the United States is going to have a monopoly on the use of AI in weaponry, certainly that's not going to be the case. So we need to get our arms around this, not just as a domestic society, but as President Zelenskyy said, as a world community, or it's going to be something we're going to regret a great deal. As we heard earlier in our conversation in the first part of this with our colleague Eliza Sweren-Becker, there's a lot happening. There's a lot happening every minute of every day. We think that these kinds of issues are what we ought to be talking about. It is an important thing to understand about this war, and the fact that we are spending time in Congress instead grappling with this egregious voter restriction bill that would kick millions of people off the rolls, instead of dealing with these big issues around the authorization for these military hostilities, around energy, around the economy, around affordability, around all the things that are actually the important things that our society ought to be grappling with. That just shows the degree, I would suggest, that our politics are out of whack. This is going to be not just an election about the attack on democracy and voting, but an election in a lot of different ways around AI. People talk about in 2026 or maybe 2028, when somebody comes up with a coherent public platform to address people's concerns about this technology that is already unnerving to people, it is going to be extraordinarily potent politically. This has to be part of it. We're going to keep on it. We're going to keep paying attention to it and let you know about it here at the Brennan Center for Justice. If you enjoyed this conversation in this very busy week in March 2026, putting us in the very spot in history, if you enjoyed this, please follow us on the platforms where you follow podcasts. Give us 5 stars or more, whatever you can give us. And above all else, please let your friends know about this. Let people who are interested in these issues know about it. The fight for democracy, the fight for justice, it's going on every day, and we want to make sure everybody is fully up to speed. Thank you so much.